Don't speak unless you're spoken to. The man at table 12 muttered without even looking at me, and I felt the words land heavier than the tray in my hands. But I didn't react, didn't flinch, just steadied the glasses before they could betray me, because I had learned a long time ago that silence wasn't weakness, it was control, and control was the only thing no one here could take from me. Not in a room like this where chandeliers hung like frozen fire above polished marble floors, and every voice was measured in money, not kindness. I moved between tables like I didn't belong, and maybe I didn't, not in their eyes. Just another waitress in a black uniform that didn't quite fit right, hair pulled back too tight, shoes worn down from double shifts. But I knew how to carry myself, knew how to look without staring, listen without being noticed, exist without being remembered, until the doors opened and everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle ripple like. The air itself recognized him before anyone else did. Adrian Volkov didn't need an introduction. The room adjusted around him. Conversations softened, laughter thinned. Even the music felt like it stepped back, and I felt it too. That quiet pressure in my chest. Not fear exactly. Something sharper, something older, because I knew that name. I shouldn't have, but I did, and I kept my head down, focused on the tray, on the rhythm of my steps, on not looking up, not letting my eyes betray what my mind already understood. But then I saw her, seated at the center table like she owned not just the room but the people inside it. Irina Volkov, elegant, composed, her presence colder than the ice in the glasses I carried, her posture perfect, her gaze sharper than anything spoken aloud. And when the host gestured for me to approach, I felt that pull. That moment where you could walk away or step closer to something that might change everything. And I stepped forward, because that's what I was. Paid to do, serve, smile, disappear. I placed the glasses carefully, one by one, keeping my movements precise, controlled, invisible, until she spoke. Not to me, not really, but about me, her voice smooth. Deliberate, in Russian, a language most of the table didn't understand, but I did. Every word, every nuance, every quiet dismissal wrapped in elegance. She said something about service, about standards, about how some people should know their place, and the table chuckled politely, not cruelly, just enough to agree, and I felt it, that familiar pressure behind my ribs, the memory of being underestimated, overlooked, reduced to something smaller than I was. And I could have walked away, I should have walked away, but my hands didn't move, my feet stayed rooted. And for 2 seconds the world narrowed to the sound of my own breathing, steady, controlled. And then I spoke, softly at first, just enough for her to hear, in Russian, correcting her, not rudely, not emotionally, just precisely, the way my grandmother used to correct me when I mispronounced a word, the way you correct someone you expect better from. And the effect was immediate. The air shifted, the table went still, the laughter died mid-breath, and Irina Volkov looked at me. Really looked at me for the first time. Her expression not angry, not offended, but curious, calculating, as if she had just discovered something out of place in a room she thought she understood completely. And I held her gaze, not challenging, not submissive, just steady, because I wasn't playing a role anymore, not in that moment, not in that silence. And I could feel it, the weight of another gaze across the room, heavier, sharper. Adrian, I didn't need to look to know he was watching now. The way the room had gone quiet told me everything, and Irina's voice came again, this time directed at me, slower, testing, asking where I learned to speak like that. And I felt my pulse rise just once before settling again, because this was the line, the moment where things either stayed the same or shifted completely, and I chose my words carefully, quietly, so only she could hear. You used to visit my grandmother, I said for the first time. Her composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for me to see it, and across the table, I heard the faintest sound of glass stopping midair, and I knew without turning that he had frozen too. That something I said had reached further than I intended, or maybe exactly as far as it was always meant to go. Irina Volkov did not blink, but something in her posture changed, just a fraction, just enough for someone like me to notice, because I had spent years reading the smallest shifts in people who thought they were impossible to read. Her fingers rested lightly on the stem of her glass, but they did not move, not even when the room slowly began to breathe again, conversations returning in hesitant fragments. as if everyone was pretending nothing had happened while silently waiting for what would come next. And I stayed exactly where I was, tray balanced, shoulders steady, because leaving now would feel like retreat, and I was not retreating, not after crossing that line, not after saying something that clearly mattered more than I intended to reveal. Her eyes searched my face again, deeper this time, as if trying to place me in a memory she had not touched in years, and when she spoke, her voice was lower, more controlled, still in Russian, but now there was no dismissal in it, only precision, only calculation. She asked for my name, and I felt that question settle between us like a test I had already chosen to take. Emily, I said, keeping my tone even, respectful but not small, and I saw it then, the flicker of recognition that she tried to hide. A name could be coincidence, but something else was connecting for her, something she was not ready to say out loud. And before she could ask another question, I felt him, closer now, not just a presence across the room but right behind me, close enough that the air shifted with his movement, close enough that every instinct in my body sharpened at once, and I turned, slowly, because I refused to look startled, refused to give him that kind of reaction. And when I met Adrian Volkov's eyes for the first time, it was not the power that struck me, not the reputation, not even the way people moved aside for him. It was the focus, the way he looked at me like I was not part of the background anymore, like I was. Something he had been trying to remember, something just out of reach. His gaze dropped for half a second to my hands, then back to my face, measuring, comparing, and I realized in that moment that whatever I had just said had pulled me directly into his world, whether I wanted it or not. You speak Russian, he said, his voice calm, almost neutral, but there was something underneath it, something that did not match the ease of his tone, and I nodded once, because denying it would be pointless now. My grandmother taught me, I said, choosing the same answer but letting it settle differently. This time, letting him hear what I was not saying, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, filled with something unspoken that neither of us was ready to name. Irina stood then, slow, deliberate, and every movement she made carried weight, not just because of who she was, but because of what she knew. She stepped closer to me, close enough that I could see the fine lines around her eyes, the details that power usually hid from the world, and when she spoke again, it was softer, almost careful. What was her name? She asked, and for the first time, I hesitated, not because I did not know the answer, but because I understood exactly what answering would do. It would confirm everything. It would open a door that had been closed for years, and I had spent a long time keeping that door shut. But I also knew that not answering would only make things worse. So I took a breath, steady, controlled, and said it. Anastasia Morozova. And the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. Irina's expression stilled completely, like a piece of glass catching light, and Adrian's jaw tightened just enough that most people would miss it. But I did not, because I was watching for it, because I needed to know how far this had gone, and suddenly the room felt smaller. Like everything else had faded out, and there were only three of us left standing in the center of something that had been waiting to happen. Irina exhaled slowly, her gaze never leaving mine, and when she spoke again, it was not a question, it was a statement, quiet but certain. She disappeared, she said, and I felt that word settle into my chest, because it was true, because that was the story they had, the version that made sense from the outside. And I held her gaze as I answered, just as quietly, only to you. And that was the moment everything shifted, not just in her eyes, not just in his, but in the space between us, because now it was no longer about a waitress who spoke a language she should not know. It was about something deeper, something unfinished, and Adrian took one step closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence, close enough that there was no space left for pretending this was still a coincidence. His voice dropped when he spoke again, low enough that only I could hear. Where have you been? He asked. And I realized then that he was not asking out of curiosity. He was asking because the answer mattered to him in a way that went beyond this room, beyond this night. And I held his gaze for one steady second before answering. Exactly where you never thought to look. And I watched the realization begin to form in his eyes as the past reached forward into the present and refused to stay buried any longer. The air between us did not move after I said it. Like even the music had decided to stay quiet and listen. And for a moment, I wondered if I had gone too far. If this was the part where everything collapsed back into place and I became invisible again. But Adrian did not step away. He stepped closer, slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that made space instead of taking it. And I felt it in the way the room adjusted. People shifting without realizing why, like gravity had changed direction. His eyes stayed on mine, not cold, not distant, but searching, like he was trying to match the person standing in front of him with a memory that refused to fully surface. And I held that gaze because looking away now would mean giving up control, and I had not come this far to lose it in a single second. "You expect me to believe that," he said quietly, his voice steady but edged with something I could not ignore, not anger, not disbelief, something closer to recognition that had not yet found. "It's proof," and I tilted my head just slightly, not challenging, not softening, just enough to let him know I was not afraid of the question. "I do not expect anything," I said, keeping my tone even, measured. "I just answered you." And that seemed to unsettle him more than anything else I could have said, because people like him were used to reactions, fear, admiration, resistance, but not calm, not this kind of stillness that did not bend. And I saw it in the way his jaw tightened for half a second before he smoothed it out again. Control returning like it always did, practiced. Precise. Irina watched both of us now, her silence heavier than any words she could have spoken, and I knew she was putting the pieces together faster than he was, because she had known my grandmother, because she had seen that world from the inside long before I ever understood what it meant. "You should not be here," she said finally, not harsh, not unkind, but certain, like she was stating a fact that could not be argued. And I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, because that was the point, was it not? I had never been meant to be here, not in this room, not in this life. And yet here I was, standing in front of them, refusing to step back. "I work here," I replied simply, and for the first time, something like emotion flickered across her face. Not pity, not exactly, something closer to regret, and that surprised me more than anything else tonight, because I had not expected that from her, not from someone who carried herself like the world owed her obedience. Adrian's gaze shifted between us, sharper now, more focused, like he had finally decided that this was no longer a coincidence worth dismissing. "If you knew her," he said, his voice lower, more controlled, "then you know she was not the kind of woman who disappeared without reason." And I felt that sentence settle into me, heavy with everything he was not saying, everything he expected me to fill in. And I could have given him an easy answer, something vague, something that would let me step away and let this moment fade. But I did not, because this was not about ease. This was about truth, or at least as much of it as I was willing to give. "She did not disappear," I said. Quietly, holding his gaze steady, "She chose to leave." And that landed differently. I saw it in the way his expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, because choice implied something else, something harder to accept, something that did not fit into the version of the past he had been given. Irina inhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing just enough to show that she understood exactly what I was doing, not lying, not revealing everything, just enough to change the shape of the story, and that was power, not loud, not aggressive, just precise, controlled. "And you?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost careful again. "Did you choose this as well?" And for a second, just a second, I let myself feel it, the weight of that question, the years between then and now, the distance between who I had been and who I had become, standing here in a uniform that told one story while everything inside me told another. And I straightened just slightly, not for them, but for myself. "I chose to stay," I said, and that was the truth, the part of it that mattered, the part that defined me more than anything else I could explain. Adrian exhaled slowly, like he had just realized that whatever this was, it was not going to end with a simple answer. His hand moved slightly, not toward me, not touching, but close enough that I noticed, close enough that I understood the intention behind it. Not control, not possession, something else, something that felt dangerously close to certainty. "Then you are not leaving tonight," he said, not as an order, not exactly, but not as a suggestion either. And I met his eyes without hesitation, because this was the moment, the line that could not be ignored. And I shook my head once, slow, deliberate. That is not your decision, I said, and the silence that followed was sharper than anything before it, because this time, it was not about who I was or what I knew. It was about whether I would bend, and I did not. I stayed exactly where I was, steady, unshaken. And for the first time since he walked into the room, Adrian Volkov did not look like the man everyone else feared. He looked like a man who had just realized that control did not work on me the way it worked on everyone else, and that realization changed everything. The silence did not break the way it usually did, not with nervous laughter or someone changing the subject. It stretched, thin and sharp, until it became something else entirely, something that belonged to us and no one else. And I felt it in the way people nearby pretended to keep talking while their attention stayed fixed on the space between me and Adrian, waiting to see who would move first, who would give, who would remember their place. But I did not move, and neither did he, and that was the problem, because men like him were not used to standing still, not used to someone meeting them without stepping back, and I saw the moment it shifted in him. Not anger, not frustration, something quieter, something more dangerous, curiosity, real curiosity, the kind that did not fade after a single answer. "Everything here is my decision," he said finally, his voice calm, controlled. But there was no force behind it this time, no expectation that I would obey, just a statement, like he was reminding himself as much as me. And I let the words settle before I answered, because rushing would make it feel like a reaction, and I was not reacting, I was choosing, not everything. I said, my tone even, not raised, not softened, just clear, and I watched the smallest shift in his expression, not visible to anyone else, but there. The recognition that this was not a conversation he could end the way he usually did. Irina's gaze moved between us again, sharper now, assessing something deeper than before, and I realized she was no longer questioning who I was. She was questioning what I would do, and that mattered more, because identity could be explained, but choices revealed everything. "You speak like someone who understands consequence," she said, her voice quieter now, less performative, more real. And I gave a small nod, because that at least was simple. "I do," I replied, and for a moment, just a moment, something like approval passed through her eyes before it disappeared behind that same composed exterior, and I wondered what she saw when she looked at me now. Not a waitress, not just a girl, with the wrong accent in the wrong room. Something else, something that connected to a past she had not expected to face again. Adrian shifted slightly, not stepping closer, not stepping back, just enough to change the angle of his stance, like he was recalibrating, adjusting to something new. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, meant only for me. "Then you understand why I cannot let this end here," he said. And I held his gaze without hesitation, because this was where the lines blurred, where his world reached for mine and expected it to fold. And I felt the old instinct rise, the one that said to stay quiet, to disappear, to let powerful people decide how things would go. But that instinct did not belong to me anymore. Not fully, not after everything I had chosen. "You can try," I said, not challenging, not mocking, just honest. And that honesty seemed to affect him more than anything else I could have done, because it left no room for misinterpretation, no space to pretend this was something it was not. The room felt smaller now, tighter, like the walls had shifted in a few inches, and I became aware of everything at once. The faint clink of glass somewhere behind me, the soft hum of conversation returning in cautious waves, the weight of eyes that pretended not to watch but did anyway. And through all of it, his focus did not break, not even for a second. "Emily," he said, my name sounding different in his voice, not casual, not distant, something deliberate. And I felt the impact of that more than I expected, because names had power, and he was using mine like it mattered, like it meant something beyond a label on a uniform. "You are not who you appear to be," he continued, and I let out a slow breath, because that was the closest he had come to saying it out loud, to acknowledging what was sitting between us, and I tilted my head slightly, considering, not denying, not confirming, just letting the truth exist without explaining it. "Neither are you," I replied, and that earned the faintest hint of a smile, not amusement, not warmth, something sharper, like appreciation for a move he had not expected. Irina stepped back then, just one step, but it changed everything. It gave us space, not physical distance. but something else, permission, and I realized she was no longer trying to control the conversation. She was observing it, letting it unfold, and that told me more than anything she could have said, because people like her did not step back unless they wanted to see where something led. Adrian's gaze flickered briefly to her, then back to me, as if confirming that silent shift, and when he spoke again, there was something new in his voice, not softer, not weaker, just different. "Walk with me," he said, and it was not a command, not entirely, but it carried weight, expectation, possibility, and I felt the room hold its breath again, waiting, always waiting, because this was the moment that would define everything that came after. And I looked at him, really looked this time, at the man everyone else adjusted themselves around, at the power he carried without effort, at the certainty that usually followed him like a shadow, and I measured it against my own, quieter, less visible, but just as real. And for a second, just a second, I let the silence stretch again, let him feel what it was like not to be answered immediately, not to be obeyed without question, and then I moved, not toward him, not away, just enough to show that I was not refusing, but I was not following either, and I said the only thing that made sense in that moment, the only thing that kept the balance exactly where I wanted it. "You can walk," I said calmly. "I will decide if I join you." And the look in his eyes then was not surprise, not entirely. It was something deeper, something that told me he understood exactly what I was doing, and more importantly, that he was not going to stop me. He did not move right away, and that told me more than if he had simply turned and walked, because it meant he was thinking, recalculating, adjusting to a situation that no longer followed the rules he was used to, and I stayed exactly where I was, tray still balanced in my hand, posture steady, as if nothing had changed, even though everything had, the weight of the moment still hanging between us, visible only to those who understood what had just happened, and I could feel the room watching in fragments, glances that came and went, whispers that never fully formed, because no one wanted to be the one caught paying too much attention. Adrian finally exhaled, slow and controlled, like he was letting go of something unnecessary, and then he did what I did not expect. He stepped back, just one step, creating space instead of closing it. And that single movement shifted the balance again, not in his favor, not in mine, but into something new, something neither of us had planned for. "You always decide for yourself," he said, almost like a statement of fact rather than a question, and I met his gaze without hesitation, because that at least was simple. "I try to," I replied, and there was the faintest hint of something in his expression again, not amusement, not exactly approval, but recognition, as if he had just found something he had not realized he was looking for. Irina watched this exchange in silence, her presence still strong, still undeniable, but no longer directing the moment, only observing it. And I wondered what she saw now, whether she recognized the same shift I felt, the way this conversation had moved beyond its original boundaries into something neither of us could easily step away from. "Then decide carefully," she said, her voice calm, measured, but carrying a weight that did not need to be raised to be felt. And I inclined my head slightly in acknowledgement, because that was the kind of advice that did not need to be argued, only understood. And Adrian turned then, not abruptly, not dismissively, just enough to break the direct line between us, his attention shifting outward for a moment, as if he was allowing the room to exist again, giving everyone the illusion that whatever had just happened was over, even though it was not really. I watched him take a few steps toward the edge of the room, toward the tall windows that overlooked the city lights stretching out, like something endless and untouchable. And for a second, I considered letting it end there, letting the moment settle into something distant, something that could be remembered without changing anything else. But I knew better than that. Moments like this did not disappear. They waited, they returned, they demanded to be finished, and I felt it again, that quiet pull, not from him exactly, but from everything that had been left unsaid, everything that had started the second I opened my mouth in a language I was not supposed to know. My grip on the tray loosened slightly as I handed it off to another server passing behind me. My movements automatic, practiced, invisible again to anyone who was not looking closely, and then I moved, not quickly, not hesitantly, just steadily, crossing the same polished floor that had felt like a barrier minutes ago. now feeling like something I had already stepped beyond. He did not turn when I approached, not immediately, but I knew he was aware. I could see it in the slight shift of his shoulders, the way his posture adjusted without losing its composure, and I stopped a few feet away, not too close, not too far, keeping that same careful distance that had defined everything between us so far. The city lights reflected in the glass in front of him, casting a soft glow that made everything feel quieter, more contained. "You did not leave," he said after a moment, his voice low, almost thoughtful, and I let out a small breath, because that was not the reaction most people expected. "Neither did you," I replied, and this time, when he turned to face me, there was no hesitation in it, no testing, just certainty, as if something had settled into place. For him, something he was no longer questioning. "I do not leave unfinished things," he said, and I held his gaze, because I understood exactly what he meant, even if he had not said it directly. "Then maybe you should decide what this is first," I said, my tone calm, not defensive, not inviting, just honest, and that seemed to land deeper than anything else, because it forced him to define something he could not yet fully see. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, less sharp, more focused, like it was leading somewhere instead of holding us still, and I could see it in his eyes, the shift from reaction to intention, from curiosity to something more deliberate. "It is not coincidence," he said finally, not asking, not doubting, just stating it as truth, and I felt that settle in me, because I had known that from the start. "No," I said quietly, "it is not." And for a second, we just stood there, the noise of the room fading into something distant, the city outside steady and endless, and the space between us no longer uncertain, just undefined. And then he took a step closer, not enough to break that balance, but enough to make the moment undeniable. "Then we are going to find out why," he said, his voice calm, certain, and I did not look away, did not step back, because I knew the same thing, even if I had not planned to admit it. Even if I had spent years keeping it buried, some things did not stay hidden forever, and whatever this was, it had already begun. The words stayed between us, quiet but immovable, like something that had already decided its place before either of us spoke it out loud. And I felt the shift settle deeper, not just in him, not just in me, but in the space that had been carved out by everything we had said and everything we had refused to say. The city lights behind him stretched endlessly, reflections breaking across the glass like fractured stars, and for a moment, it felt like we were standing outside of time, separate from the noise, separate from the expectations that still lingered in the room behind us. And yet I could feel them, the weight of that world waiting just a few feet away, ready to pull everything back into its structure if we let it. "You already know more than you are saying," Adrian said, his voice quieter now, not demanding, not forcing, just certain. And I did not answer immediately, not because I did not have an answer, but because timing mattered, silence mattered, the space between. Words could shape them just as much as the words themselves. I turned my gaze slightly toward the glass, letting my reflection meet his for a brief second instead of his actual eyes, because sometimes distance made truth easier to hold. "And you already believe more than you should," I replied, my tone even, controlled, and I saw it again, that subtle reaction, not visible to anyone else, but there. The acknowledgement that I was not wrong, that something in him had already shifted beyond logic, beyond caution, and that was dangerous, not for me, but for him, because men like Adrian Volkov did not allow uncertainty to exist without resolving it. "Belief is not something I rely on," he said, but the way he said it lacked the certainty it should have carried, and that told me everything I needed to know. I turned back to face him fully, closing the small distance just enough to remove the reflection from between us, because this was no longer something that could be spoken through layers. It had to be direct. "Then why are you still here?" I asked, not challenging, not accusing, just asking the question that mattered. And for a second, just a second, there was no answer, no immediate response shaped by control or habit, just silence, real silence, the kind that revealed more than words ever could. And I watched it happen, the moment he realized that there was no simple explanation that would fit into the version of himself he presented to the world, no easy answer that would make this disappear, and instead of forcing one, he did something else entirely, something I had not expected. He exhaled slowly and let that silence exist, let it remain unanswered. And that was the first real crack in the control he carried so effortlessly. Not weakness, not loss, just a shift, a willingness to let something remain undefined. And that changed everything, because it meant he was no longer trying to end this. He was allowing it to continue. Because this is not finished, he said finally. And this time, there was no edge in his voice, no need to assert anything. Just truth, simple and unguarded in a way that felt more powerful than anything he had said before. And I felt something in me respond to that. Not agreement, not resistance, something quieter, something that recognized the same thing from a different place. No, I said softly. It is not. And for a moment, we stood there again, not as opposites, not as two people from different worlds colliding, but as something else entirely, something that had not yet found its definition. And I became aware of the faint sound of footsteps behind me, the subtle signal that the night was continuing whether we acknowledged it or not, that the world we had stepped out of was still moving forward. And I knew I could not stay here indefinitely, not without consequences, not without drawing attention that would shift this into something else, something louder, something less controlled. And that was not what I wanted, not yet. I stepped back slightly, just enough to reintroduce that distance, that balance that had allowed this to exist in the first place. And I saw the way his gaze followed the movement, not possessive, not controlling, just aware, tracking, understanding. I have to go back, I said. And it was not an apology, not a request, just a fact. And for a second, I thought he might push back, might try to stop the moment from ending on my terms. But he did not. He nodded once, slow, deliberate, like he understood exactly what I was doing. Not leaving, not escaping, just pausing. You will not disappear. Again, he said. And this time it was not a question, not even a statement meant to control. It was something else, something that carried weight because it was rooted in what had already happened, in the past neither of us had fully spoken about. And I met his gaze one last time before stepping away, because that mattered, because leaving without answering would have shifted the balance in a way I did not want. I did not disappear, I said quietly, holding his eyes steady. You just stopped looking, and I saw it land, not like a challenge, not like an accusation, but like a truth he could not ignore. And for the first time since this began, I was the one who turned first, stepping back into the rhythm of the room, into the movement, the noise, the roles that defined everything around us. But it felt different now, lighter and heavier at the same time, because I knew something had changed, not just in him, not just in me, but in the path ahead, and I did not need to look back to know that he was still watching, that this was not over, that whatever we had just started would not stay contained within a single night, because some things did not fade when you walked away. They followed, they waited, and they returned when you least expected them. The tray felt lighter in my hands when I picked it up again, like something invisible had been taken off me without permission, or maybe I had just stopped carrying it the same way. I moved through the room the way I always did, quiet, efficient, unnoticed, but it was different now, not because of what I was doing, but because of who was watching. I could feel it without turning, the weight of his attention following every step, not constant, not obvious, but there, like a thread that had been tied between us and refused to break. And I hated how aware I was of it, hated that part of me noticed the exact second it shifted, the exact second his focus moved away and the room exhaled again, like everyone had been holding something they did not understand. Emily. Someone called from behind the bar, and I turned automatically, slipping back into motion, into routine, because routine was safe. Routine did not ask questions I was not ready to answer. I set down the tray, grabbed a clean cloth, wiped a surface that did not need wiping, anything to keep my hands busy while my mind refused to settle. Table 8 needs water, the manager said, his voice sharp but normal, unchanged by anything that had just happened, and I nodded, because that was the part that mattered, the part of the world that did not bend for men like Adrian Volkov, at least not on the surface, and I walked, steady, controlled, counting my steps without realizing it. 1, 2, 3, like grounding myself in something real, something simple. But even as I poured water into crystal glasses and smiled at people who did not see me, my thoughts stayed somewhere else, caught in the space between his last words and mine. in the way he had not tried to stop me, in the way he had let me walk away without forcing the moment to end on his terms. That was not how men like him operated, and that was what unsettled me the most. Not his power, not his presence, but the restraint, the choice to let something exist without controlling it. I finished the table, moved on, repeated the same motions, but the rhythm fell off, like I was half a step behind myself, and I knew why. Because part of me was still standing by that window, still holding that conversation that had not really ended, just paused. And I wondered if he was still there, if he had gone back to his world as easily as he stepped into it, if this had already been filed away as something minor, something unimportant, but something in me told me it had not. Something told me this had stayed with him the same way it stayed with me. Not loud, not urgent, just present, constant. And that thought followed me through the rest of the night, through every table, every quiet interaction, every polite smile that felt thinner than usual, until the music softened, the lights dimmed just slightly, and the signal passed through the room that the event was ending, not abruptly, just gradually, like everything here, controlled, measured. And I felt the shift immediately, the way people began to gather their things, the way conversations turned toward exits and final impressions. And I moved with it, clearing glasses, collecting plates, slipping through the space like I had done 100 times before. But this time, I was aware of something else, a question that had not been answered, something unfinished that had not been resolved by distance or time. And when I finally stepped back toward the service area, placing the last tray down with careful precision, I let myself breathe, just once, deep enough to feel it settle. Because the night was almost over, because I could leave, because I could step out of this and pretend it had not changed anything. And that was when I heard it, not loud, not calling, just my name, spoken in a way that made it impossible to ignore, Emily. And I froze for half a second before turning, because I knew that voice now, knew the weight behind it, knew what it meant when he chose to use it. Adrian stood a few feet away, not surrounded, not commanding the room, just there. And somehow that made him more noticeable than anything else he could have done. His posture relaxed but intentional, his gaze steady, not searching this time, not questioning, just certain. And I felt that same shift again, the one that pulled everything else slightly out of focus, the one that reminded me this was not over, not even close. I stepped toward him, slow, deliberate, because rushing would mean something I was not willing to give. And when I stopped in front of him, I held that same distance, that same balance we had kept all night. You stayed, I said, and it was not a question, not really, just an acknowledgement of something that mattered more than it should have. And he nodded once, like that answer had been decided long before I asked. So did you? He replied, and there was something in his voice now, not curiosity, not control, something steadier, something that felt like a decision rather than a reaction. And I felt it settle between us again, that quiet certainty that whatever this was, it was not going to end with a single conversation, not going to disappear the second we walked out of this room. And I knew then, without needing to ask, without needing to hear it said out loud, that this night was not the beginning of something simple. It was the beginning of something that would not let either of us go easily, no matter how much we tried to pretend otherwise. The room was almost empty now, the kind of quiet that only comes after something important has already happened, when the noise fades but the weight remains. And I stood there for a second longer than I should have, just looking at him, trying to understand what had changed and what had not, because it was not the same as before, not just a passing moment between strangers. Something had settled, something neither of us had chosen, but neither of us was walking away from either, and I felt it in the way he did not rush the silence, did not fill it with words that would make this easier to define. You should be tired, he said finally, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful, and I let out a small breath, because that was not what I expected him to say, not after everything, not after the tension that had built and refused to break. I admitted, because there was no reason to pretend otherwise, not here, not now. And something in his expression shifted again, softer this time, not in a way that made him less dangerous, but in a way that made him more real, more present than the version of him everyone else saw from a distance. Then why are you still standing here? He asked, and I met his gaze without hesitation, because the answer was simple even if it did not make sense. Because you are, I said, and that landed between us like everything else had tonight, quiet but undeniable. And for a second, neither of us looked away. Neither of us tried to change the direction of where this was going, because we both understood now that this was not about convenience or timing. It was about something that had already begun before either of us realized it. The faint sound of chairs being moved behind me reminded me that the night was ending whether we acknowledged it or not, that the space we were standing in would not remain ours much longer, and I knew what came next, not because he said it, but because it was the only direction left. "Walk with me," he said again, this time quieter, not an invitation the room could hear, not something meant to be observed, just something meant for me. And I studied him for a moment, not his face, not the obvious details everyone else noticed, but the way he held himself, the way he waited, not expecting, not forcing, just allowing the choice to exist. And I realized then that this was different from before, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. And I nodded once, small but certain, because I was choosing this, not reacting, not being pulled, choosing, and we moved together, not side by side exactly, not close enough to blur the space between us, but close enough that the distance no longer felt like separation. The hallway beyond the main room was quieter, dimmer, the sounds of the event fading behind us with each step, replaced by something softer, something more real, the faint hum of the building, the distant echo of footsteps, the kind of silence that did not belong to performance or expectation, and I felt it settle around us, changing the way everything felt, the way everything mattered. He slowed slightly as we reached the end of the corridor, where a large window overlooked the city from a different angle, higher, more distant, the lights below stretching out like something untouchable. And he stopped there, turning just enough to face me again, and I realized this was not about leaving. Not yet. This was about continuing, about taking what had started in that room and bringing it somewhere it could exist without interruption. "You said I stopped looking," he began, his voice steady but quieter than before, and I felt that line return, the weight of it, the truth behind it that neither of us had fully unpacked. "Maybe I did," he continued, not denying it, not avoiding it, just acknowledging it in a way that felt more honest than anything else he could have said. And I watched him carefully, because this was the part that mattered, not the power, not the presence, but the willingness to stand in something uncertain and not turn away. "Why did she leave?" he asked, and this time, the question was not about curiosity, not about control, it was about understanding, about something deeper that it had nothing to do with the room we had just left behind. And I felt the answer rise in me, familiar and complicated at the same time, because it was not simple, because it was not something that could be explained in a single sentence. And I held his gaze for a long second before speaking, because once I said this, there would be no pretending this was still surface level, no stepping back into something easier, because staying meant becoming someone she did not recognize anymore. I said, quietly, and I saw it land, not immediately, not in a visible way, but in the stillness that followed, in the way he did not interrupt, did not question, just absorbed it. And I continued before the moment could shift away, and she refused to lose herself for a world that would not change for her. And this time, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with meaning, heavy with implication. And I saw something in his eyes then, not agreement, not rejection, something else. Something that told me he understood more than he wanted to admit. And that was when I realized this was no longer just about the past, no longer just about my grandmother or what had happened years ago. It was about him too, about the choices he had made and the ones he had not yet faced. And the realization settled between us, quiet and undeniable, like everything else tonight. And I knew without needing to say it that whatever came next would not be simple, would not be easy, but it would be real, and neither of us was walking away from that anymore. He did not answer right away, and that silence told me more than any words could have, because it was not empty. It was full of something he was not used to holding, something that did not fit into the structure of control he carried so naturally. And I watched it happen in real time. The shift from understanding to reflection, the moment when what I said stopped being about the past and started becoming something personal, something that touched him in a way he had not expected. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, not avoidance, not weakness, just thought, real thought. And when he looked back at me, There was something different there, not less intensity, not less focus, but more depth, like he was no longer just looking at me. He was seeing something through me, something connected to everything he had not yet questioned about his own world. "You think she was right," he said quietly, not as a challenge, not as a dismissal, but as a genuine question, and I felt the weight of that settle between us, because this was not about right or wrong, not in the way people like him usually defined it. "I think she chose what she could live with," I answered, my voice steady, because that was the truth, not simple, not absolute, just real, and I saw the way that landed, the way it shifted something behind his eyes that he did not immediately show, because choice was not something his world allowed easily, not without consequence, not without cost. And for a moment, the city outside seemed louder, brighter, like it was pressing against the glass trying to remind us that everything continued whether we paused or not. Adrian turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the skyline, but I knew he was not looking at it. Not really. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere deeper, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something quieter but heavier. "She left everything behind," he said, and I heard the unspoken part, the part that mattered, the part that asked if it had been worth it, if losing that world had given her something better, and I held that question carefully before answering. Because this was not about proving anything. It was about understanding. "She did not see it as losing," I said softly. "She saw it as choosing herself." And this time, the silence that followed was longer, deeper. Because that idea did not belong easily in his world. It did not fit into the rules he had built his life around. And I could see it, the way he processed it, not rejecting it, not accepting it fully, just holding it there, turning it over like something unfamiliar but impossible to ignore. And for a second, I wondered what that felt like for him, to stand in something that did not have a clear answer, that did not bend to his understanding of control. And I realized then that this was the real shift, not the language, not the past, but this moment where he was allowing himself to question something deeper, something that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with identity. "And you," he said finally, turning back to face me, his eyes sharper now, more focused. "Would you leave everything behind?" And the question hit differently than the others, not because it was unexpected, but because it was direct, personal in a way the rest had not been, and I felt it settle in my chest before I answered, because I knew this was not just about curiosity. This was him trying to understand me in the same way I was beginning to understand him. "I already did," I said quietly, and that was the truth, even if it was not the full version of it, even if there were parts one was not ready to explain yet. And I saw it again, that flicker of realization, not surprise, not disbelief, something more controlled, more deliberate, like he was adjusting his perception of me in real time. And that mattered more than I wanted it to, because it meant he was no longer seeing me as an interruption, not as a coincidence, but as something intentional, something that had its own place in whatever this was becoming. "Then why stay here?" he asked, and there was something in his voice now, not judgment, not doubt, something closer to curiosity again, but deeper this time, more grounded, and I let out a small breath, because that was the question, was it not? The one that did not have a simple answer, the one that carried everything I had chosen and everything I had not yet figured out. "Because leaving is not the same as running," I said, my tone calm, measured, "and staying does not mean belonging." And I saw it land, not immediately, but steadily, like everything else had tonight, building rather than striking. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, because there was nothing to add, nothing to fill the space with. The truth was already there, settled between us in a way that did not need explanation. And I realized then that this was not something that could be rushed, not something that could be defined in a single conversation or a single night. This was something that would take time, something that would unfold whether we wanted it to or not. And I felt it, that quiet certainty that had been building since the beginning, the understanding that whatever this was, it was not temporary, not something that would fade when we walked away from this window. And Adrian seemed to feel it too, because when he spoke again, his voice was steady, certain in a way that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with decision. "This does not end here," he said, not as a question, not as a command, just a statement of something that had already been decided. And I met his gaze without hesitation, because I knew the same thing. even if I had not planned to admit it, even if I had spent years building a life that stayed separate from everything he represented. No, I said quietly. It does not. And the moment settled there, not dramatic, not loud, just real. And for the first time since this began, I did not feel the need to step back, to create distance, because I understood now that distance would not change anything. Not anymore, not after this, because some things did not stay contained, some things grew, and whatever we had started tonight had already moved beyond anything either of us could control. The words stayed there after I said them, not fading, not softening, just existing between us like something solid, and I could see the way they settled into him. Not rejected, not accepted fully, but acknowledged, and that mattered more than anything else, because it meant he was not dismissing it, not pushing it aside the way most people would when something did not fit into their understanding. He was holding it, considering it, and that was where everything changed, because consideration meant time, and time meant this was no longer temporary. The city lights outside flickered faintly as a car passed below, a small reminder that the world was still moving even though this moment felt suspended, and I realized how quiet it had become, not just around us, but inside me too. The tension that had been there earlier replaced by something steadier, something that did not feel like resistance anymore, but not surrender either, something in between that I had not felt in a long time. You speak like you already decided what your life will not be, Adrian said, his voice calm, thoughtful, and I met his gaze without hesitation, because that was easier than explaining everything behind it. It is easier to know what you will not become, I replied, and I saw the slight shift in his expression, the recognition of something familiar, because he understood that, even if he did not live by it the same way. And for a moment, we stood there again in that quiet understanding, not needing to fill the space with anything unnecessary, because what mattered had already been said. But silence did not last long in his world. It never did, because things had to move forward, decisions had to be made, and I could see it in the way his posture adjusted, not tightening, not closing off, but aligning, like he had reached a point where standing still was no longer enough. You cannot stay in between forever, he said, not as a warning, not as a demand, just a fact, and I let out a small breath, because that was true, even if I did not like it. Even if I had built my life around that exact space, the place where I could exist, without fully belonging anywhere. Maybe not, I said, my tone even. But I am not choosing for someone else's comfort. And that landed the way everything else had tonight. Not loud, not sharp, just steady, and I saw it again. That shift in him, not resistance, not challenge, but understanding, and something else beneath it, something that had not been there before, respect. Quiet but undeniable. And that changed the way he looked at me, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough that I felt it, enough that it altered the space between us in a way that could not be undone. He took a small step closer, not closing the distance entirely, just enough to make the moment more direct, more focused, and I did not step back, because this was not about distance anymore. It was about presence. You are not where you are by accident, he said, and I tilted my head slightly, considering. Because that statement carried more than it seemed. It was not just about tonight. Not just about this room. It was about everything that had led here, every choice I had made, every path I had taken. Neither are you, I replied, and for the first time, there was no hint of deflection in his expression, no shift away from the truth of it, just acknowledgement, because we both knew that was real, that nothing about this was random, not the past, not the present. Not the fact that we were standing here having a conversation neither of us had planned. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly from the hallway behind us. A reminder that this moment was not isolated, that there were still people moving through the building, still a world continuing just outside this space. And I knew what that meant, that this could not remain contained forever, that eventually, something would have to give, a decision would have to be made, not about tonight, but about what came after, and I felt it again. That quiet pull, not from him exactly, but from the direction this was heading. Something inevitable that neither of us was trying to stop. What happens next? He asked, and this time, it was not rhetorical, not something he already had an answer for. It was a real question, and I felt it settle in me before I answered, because this was the part that mattered, the part that would shape everything else, And I did not rush it, did not soften it, just said it the way it was. That depends on whether you are asking as the man you are, I said, my voice steady, or the man you could be. And that landed differently than anything else I had said tonight, because it was not about the past, not about what had happened or what had been lost. It was about choice, about something that had not yet been decided. And I saw it in his eyes. The way that question did not slide past him, did not get dismissed or redefined. It stayed, sharp and clear, demanding an answer he did not immediately have. And for a second, just a second, the certainty that surrounded him wavered, not enough for anyone else to see, but enough for me. Enough to understand that this was the real turning point, not the language, not the connection to my grandmother, but this question that forced him to look beyond the life he had built and consider something else, something unfamiliar. And that was where everything shifted again, because once that question existed, it could not be ignored, not by him, not by me, not by whatever this was becoming. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with possibility, with something that had not yet taken shape but already felt real. And I realized then that this was no longer just a moment between two people from different worlds. It was the beginning of something that would change both of them, whether they wanted it to or not. He did not answer right away, and this time the silence felt different, heavier, like it had crossed a line neither of us could step back over. Because the question I asked was not something that could be dismissed or redirected. It demanded something real, something that could not hide behind control or habit. And I watched him closely, not his posture, not the obvious details everyone else noticed, but the small things. The way his breathing slowed, the way his focus sharpened instead of shifting away, and I realized he was not avoiding it. He was facing it, in his own way, on his own terms. You think I have not already made that choice, he said finally, his voice steady but quieter than before, and I held his gaze, because this was the moment where truth mattered more than anything else. I think you made a choice that worked, I replied, my tone calm, measured, not necessarily the one you wanted. And I saw it land, not with resistance, not with denial, but with something deeper, something that did not show on the surface but settled underneath, because it was not easy to hear, not for someone who had built his entire life on decisions that could not be undone. And for a second, just a second, there was something in his expression that felt almost unguarded, not weak, not uncertain, just real, and that changed everything, because it meant this was no longer a conversation between roles, between a waitress and a man of power. It was something else entirely, something that existed outside of those definitions. You speak like you understand that difference, he said, and I let out a quiet breath, because that part was simple, even if nothing else was. I do, I said, and I did not elaborate, did not explain the years or the choices or the reasons behind it, because I did not need to, not here, not now, and he seemed to understand that, because he did not press further, did not try to pull more from me than I was offering, and that restraint, that choice, shifted something again, made this feel less like a confrontation and more like something shared, something balanced. The faint hum of the building returned to my awareness, grounding me in the fact that this moment, no matter how significant it felt, was still part of a larger world, one that would not pause indefinitely, and I knew we were reaching something, not an end, but a turning point, the place where conversation became decision, where understanding had to translate into action, even if that action was simply choosing what came next. You asked what happens now, Adrian said, his voice more certain this time, not because he had all the answers, but because he had decided to stop avoiding the question, and I felt my focus sharpen in response, because this was the part that mattered, not the past, not the explanation, but the direction. Yes, I said, holding his gaze steady, and he nodded once, slow, deliberate, like he was confirming something to himself as much as to me. Now we do not pretend this was just a coincidence, he said, and there was no hesitation in it. No room for interpretation, just a clear line drawn between what had been and what would follow, and I felt something settle in me. Not surprise, not resistance, something closer to recognition, because I had known that from the beginning, even if I had not said it out loud. We already passed that point, I replied quietly, and for a moment, there was something almost like agreement between us, something that did not need to be spoken to exist, but agreement was not enough, Not here, not with someone like him. Because acknowledgement without action meant nothing, and I knew he understood that. Because I could see it in the way he stepped closer again, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to make the moment more direct, more undeniable. Then I am not going to let you disappear into a life that has nothing to do with this, he said. And this time, there was something stronger in his voice, not control, not possession, something else, something that felt dangerously close to certainty. And I felt the weight of those words, the implication behind them, the direction they pointed to, and I did not step back, did not break the moment, because I needed to understand exactly what he meant. And what if I choose that? I asked, my tone even, not defensive, not confrontational, just real. And he did not hesitate this time, did not pause to consider the answer, because he already had it. Then I will still find you, he said, and the simplicity of it, the certainty of it, landed harder than anything else he could have said, because it was not a threat, not a promise of control. It was something else entirely, something rooted in intention, in the refusal to let something important be lost again. And I felt something shift in me at that. Not fear, not resistance, something quieter, something that recognized the weight of being seen in a way that could not be undone. And for a moment, I did not answer, because there was nothing simple to say in response to that, nothing that would keep this where it was before. And I realized then that this was the real turning point, not the question I had asked, not the past we had uncovered, but this moment where both of us were choosing not to step away, not to return to something easier, something familiar. And I met his gaze again, steady, unshaken, because that was the only way forward now. Then you should be sure you know what you are looking for, I said quietly, and I saw it in his eyes, the understanding that this was not going to be simple, not going to fit into the life he had already built. And yet he did not step back, did not reconsider. He just held that gaze, unwavering, because whatever this was, it had already become something neither of us was willing to walk away from. And that was what made it real. The air felt different after that, not heavier, not lighter, just clearer, like something had been stripped away and left only what mattered. And I could feel it in the way neither of us moved to fill the silence, because there was nothing left to hide behind, no more distance that could pretend this was anything less than what it had become. And I held his gaze, steady, unshaken, even as something inside me shifted, something quieter than fear, deeper than hesitation, something that recognized the point of no return had already passed. I always know what I am looking for, Adrian said, his voice low, controlled, but there was something different in it now, something that did not rely on certainty the way it used to. And I tilted my head slightly, not challenging, not accepting, just acknowledging the weight of that statement, because knowing what you were looking for did not mean you were ready for what you found. And I wondered if he understood that yet, or if that was the part that would come later, the part no one could prepare for. That is not the same as knowing what you will find, I replied, my tone calm, measured, and I saw the shift in his eyes again, the recognition that this was not a conversation he could direct the way he was used to, that every answer I gave moved us somewhere neither of us had planned. And for a second, just a second, I saw something almost like acceptance settle into him, not of the situation, but of the uncertainty itself. And that was new. That was something I had not expected, because men like him did not usually allow space for things they could not control. And yet here he was, standing in it, not stepping away, not trying to reshape it into something easier, just letting it exist. Then maybe it is time. I do, he said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard more than anything else he could have said, because it was not defensive, not dismissive. It was open in a way that felt deliberate, like a decision he had made in that exact moment. And I felt that settle in me, not as agreement, not as resistance, just as something real, something that could not be undone once it was acknowledged. The faint echo of voices from down the hallway reminded me again that this moment was not isolated, that there were still people moving, still a world that existed outside of this quiet space we had created, and I knew it would not stay contained forever, that eventually, everything we had said would have to exist in that world too. And that was where things would change, where things would become more complicated, more real in a way that could not be ignored. This is not going to stay here, I said quietly, not as a warning, not as a question, just a fact. And he nodded once, like he had Already considered that, like he had already decided it did not matter. I know, he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just acknowledgement. And that told me more than anything else, because it meant he was not just reacting to this moment. He was choosing what came after it, choosing to let this move beyond the space where it started. And that was where the real weight settled, because choice meant consequence. And consequence was not something either of us could avoid. Not now, not after this. Then you understand what you were stepping into, I said, my voice steady, because that mattered, because this was not something that could be taken lightly, not for him, not for me. And I watched him closely, looking for any sign of hesitation, any indication that he had not fully considered it. But there was none, just that same steady focus, that same quiet certainty that had been building since the moment he chose not to walk away. I understand enough, he replied, and I let out a small breath, because that was as honest as it was going to get. Because no one ever understood everything before stepping into something that mattered, and I knew that as well as he did. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, less like something waiting to be filled, and more like something settling into place, like the end of one moment and the beginning of another. And I realized then that this was it, not the end, but the shift, the point where everything moved from possibility into reality, and I felt it in the way my thoughts steadied, in the way my body no longer felt the need to hold back, because there was nothing left to protect in the same way there had been before. I am not going to be someone you try to fit into your world, I said, my tone calm but clear, because that needed to be understood, because that was the line that could not be crossed, and I saw it land, not as a challenge, not as something to push against, but as something to consider, something to accept or walk away from. And he did neither. He simply nodded, once, deliberate, like he was acknowledging the terms without trying to change them. And that was the moment I realized just how far this had already gone, because men like him did not agree without resistance, did not accept without negotiation, and yet he did, and that meant something neither of us could ignore. And I am not asking you to, he said, his voice steady, and there was no trace of control in it, no attempt to reshape what I had said into something easier, just acceptance, and that changed everything, because it meant this was no longer about one world pulling another into it. It was about something else entirely, something that existed between them, something new, and I felt it settle, quiet and undeniable, the understanding that whatever this was, it was not going to follow the rules either of us knew, and that was what made it real, what made it impossible to ignore. And for the first time since this began, I felt something that was not tension, not uncertainty, something steadier, something that felt almost like clarity, because the path ahead was not defined, but it was real, and we were both choosing to step into it, whether we were ready or not. The moment did not end the way moments like this usually did, not with a final word, not with a clear resolution, but with something quieter, something that settled instead of closing. And I stood there for a second longer than I needed to, just looking at him, taking in the way everything had shifted without anything outwardly changing. The same hallway, the same city lights beyond the glass, but none of it felt the same anymore, because something had been set in motion that neither of us could take back, and I felt it in the steady rhythm of my breathing, in the absence of hesitation that had been there before, not because I had all the answers, but because I no longer needed them in the same way. This is where it changes, I said quietly, not as a statement for him, but as something I needed to acknowledge out loud, and his gaze did not waver, did not question it, just held steady like he understood exactly what I meant. It already has, he replied, and there was no doubt in his voice, no attempt to soften it, just truth, simple and direct. And I let out a small breath, because he was right, because whatever this was, it had started long before we stepped into this hallway, long before I spoke in a language I was not supposed to know. It had started the moment something in both of us refused to look away, and now it had reached the point where it could not be ignored, could not be undone. The faint sound of a door closing somewhere down the corridor reminded me, again, that the night was ending, that the space we were standing in would soon return to something ordinary, something that did not hold this moment the way we did, and I knew what that meant, that this was where we stepped out of it, not away from it, but forward, into whatever came next. I have to leave, I said, and this time, it was not about returning to work. not about finishing the night. It was about stepping back into a world that would not understand what had just happened, and I watched him carefully, waiting to see if this would be the point where he tried to stop it, where control returned and reshaped everything into something easier. But he did not move, did not step closer, did not reach for something that would keep me there. He just nodded once, slow and deliberate, like he had already decided that this was not something that needed to be forced, and that mattered more than anything else he could have done. "You will not disappear," he said. And this time, it was not about the past, not about something that had already happened. It was about the future, about something that had yet to be decided. And I held his gaze for a long second before answering. Because this was the part that would stay with us, the part that would define everything that followed. "I am not the one who hides," I said quietly, and I saw it land, not as a challenge, not as something to push against, but as something to remember, something that would stay with him long after this moment ended. And for a second, neither of us moved, neither of us spoke, because there was nothing left to say that would make this clearer, nothing that would change what had already been set in motion. And I realized then that this was the closest thing to an ending we were going to get. Not a conclusion, not a resolution, just a pause. A moment where everything stood still before continuing in a different direction. And I turned, not abruptly, not hesitantly, just steadily. Because leaving did not feel like walking away. It felt like carrying something forward, something that would not be left behind no matter how far I went. And I could feel it with every step, the awareness that this was not over, that it would not stay contained within this night or this place, that it would follow, that it would return, and I did not need to look back to know he was still there, still watching, still holding on to whatever this was in the same way I was, because some things did not require confirmation. Some things simply existed, undeniable and unchanging. And as I reached the end of the corridor, the sounds of the city beginning to replace the quiet behind me, I slowed just slightly, not enough to stop, just enough to feel it, the shift from one world to another, from something contained to something open. And I understood then that this was not about whether our paths would cross again. It was about when, because there was no version of this where they did not. No version where something this real simply faded into nothing. And that thought stayed with me as I stepped out into the night air, cool and steady against my skin, grounding me in something real, even as everything else felt like it had shifted beyond recognition. And I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not trying to hold on to control, not trying to predict what came next. I was simply moving forward, because whatever this was, whatever it would become, it had already begun, and neither of us was going to stop it.